Hi everyone, welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm Ariane Zurcher, and I have a request from someone who asked me to talk about how do you know when you're finished. So that's one of those big topics, right? You could probably do a couple hours on how do you know when you're finished. So I thought what I would do is I'd show a couple of examples of different things that I've worked on and the reason why I stopped when I did. And I'm also going to talk about this piece that I've been working on and why I know it's not yet finished and the things that I look for that indicate to me that it is finished. So, as I said, it's a big topic, but I'll get to it as best I can. So let's get started. This first piece, Olea, was the first one that I started this kind of improvisational stitching, interpretive stitching, expressionist stitching, whatever you want to call it, process on. It was just a plain piece of linen. It had a couple of different striations in it. There wasn't much going on. But I thought, I'm just going to stitch on it and see what happens. And so I did. And I started, and you can see here the lower right corner is where I began. And it just continued to evolve and evolve and evolve. And over time, as I continued to work on it, I had to take into account the composition, the general composition of it. It began to take on a kind of life of its own. But at a certain point, it seemed to me that it was finished. And this part that you're looking at right now is the finished piece. And I'll show you the whole thing as a static image instead of moving, so that you can see it in its entirety. So this is it right there. And I felt that I could have continued to stitch, and there were lots of areas there that certainly could have been stitched, but I felt that I wanted space. I wanted to see some areas that were free of stitching for this particular piece. So I stopped. And for me, this felt finished. I had added only one large element, which was the t-shirt in the upper right corner. Everything else was much smaller. I'd added some t-shirting, things like that. But I felt that it was done. And I ended up floating this piece on another piece of canvas that I stretched on a wooden frame. And I think it works. And I think the reason it works is because I don't have any loud divas that are just screaming out and taking over. I feel that to me, there's a conversation that's going on. It's flowing. There are different parts of this that are flowing together. I feel as though the different parts are playing well with each other. It doesn't feel like one area is just completely off and has nothing to do with the other areas. So that's the criteria by which I made the decision that this one was done for this piece. Now, this piece presented a whole new set of problems simply because I really disliked the background color that I started with. It was a challenge that I'd set up for myself, whereupon I took the first piece of linen that was sitting on a pile and I just grabbed it. And that was my challenge, that whatever that first piece was, that was what I was going to work on. And it was this sort of flesh pinkish colored fabric. And it was tough because I really disliked that background color. So I started and I did other things to it, and I ended up painting on top of it. And the process for this piece was quite a bit different than Olea, for sure. Mainly because I had to look at this as a whole, and I didn't feel that the stitching that I was doing in the beginning was giving me any real direction. And so by painting on it, I gave myself some place to go with it. I gave myself some general ideas of what I was sort of envisioning, but I had to envision it differently than I did with Olea, where I started stitching and I let the stitching lead me. With this, I really had to lead with the painting over the fabric, which then gave me a place to begin and a kind of direction to go in. There weren't a lot of striations in the background fabric either, so in addition to not liking the color, there was also not too much for me to go on. So I really had to give myself something. And I then began incorporating large elements to the piece after I had painted on top of it. This piece was the first one using Pat Polly's hand-dyed linens. It was a long strip, which I then cut the length in half and then added so that it became a square. And with this piece, it really, what I did was I took the most challenging part of it, which was the lower right corner, because that was the part that really had not a lot of dye going on. And so I immediately, the first thing I did was I put that yellow wool X down, and just to give myself something. And then I added t-shirting. And as it progressed, it was clear to me that with this kind of dynamic hand-dyed linen, it was both easier and more challenging in many ways, because the piece itself was so beautiful, I didn't want to take away from the beauty of the original fabric. But I also wanted to be able to enhance the parts of it that I found particularly interesting. And so that became the challenge, not to overwhelm what was already there, the beauty of what was there originally, but rather to enhance, as well as to keep a lookout for whether the piece was flowing. Were all the elements coming together? Were they playing nicely with each other? Was there a nice, interesting, lively dialogue happening? And at the very end, I added that piece of bark to the right edge and left it raw, which I quite like. And so how did I know it was done? I felt that the bottom section was much more heavily embellished with stitching. And as I got to the top part, I allowed myself to stitch less densely. And I felt that that was working. This piece I've called Flow. I could have kept going. I chose not to. I wanted there to be areas, especially in the top, where there were sections that were free of stitching. With this piece that I'm currently working on, it's not finished. And the reason I say that is because there are areas that to me are still not quite flowing in the way that I'd like. And so I'm going to keep going with this one. So how do I know when this one will feel finished? When all those disparate parts are all flowing, where there's a conversation that is continuing, it's lively, it's diverse, and my eye isn't zeroing in on any one part, but is instead being encouraged to move around the piece and look at lots of different areas. That's when it'll be done. I hope you found this helpful. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, let's keep stitching together.